Hello, my name is Stephen Shephard and I'm in Persepolis, Iran. Some 60 kilometers from Shiraz lies this ruined city, a once magnificent and affluent metropolis believed to be built by the Persian kings Cyrus and Darius the Great. The name Persepolis is actually an English word. It's derived from the Greek Perses, which means Persian, and polis, which means city, the Persian city. But all this was destroyed and burnt to the ground by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. In this video, we are going to unpack the first 14 years of the Persian Empire, where we'll discover there is a direct correlation with the last 14 years of the famous Daniel 9 prophecy. Right then, as much as there are many things to see in this place, such as the Achaemenid Palace, the throne room, the gate of all nations, we, however, are going to turn our focus to the tombs of King Cyrus and King Darius. About 12 kilometers from Persepolis lies an ancient necropolis, negro meaning dead and polis meaning city, the dead city or city of the dead, as there are many tombs that have been carved into this mountainside. Over this way are tombs that date back to about 1000 BC. The Persians call it Nashi Rastam, and on the other side are other tombs that date back to 270 AD, Nashi Rajab. But it is these four tombs in the middle, these four Achaemenid tombs that date back to around 500 BC, that I'm interested in. This is a tomb of King Darius. You can see the dramatic facade is in the shape of a cross, and in the top of the facade is a relief depicting the king. He's standing on a three-stepped pedestal and he has his hand raised in a gesture of worship. Floating above him is Faha, the winged representative of the Persian god Ahura Mazda, and underneath the king is the weapon bearers and Persian guards. In the side panels there are Persian-shaped inscriptions called cuneiforms, and they describe the 23 nations that are subject to the king. And of course you see the entranceway which leads into the tomb, and that would be where the body of Darius would lie in a sarcophagus. This is definitely the tomb of Darius because of the inscriptions. But what's interesting is there are three other tombs in this mountainside that are of similar layout and design, but they have no inscriptions. And if they have no inscriptions, then who do they belong to? It's interesting that there are three other tombs at Nashi Rastam which are thought to be attributed to Darius' successors, Xerxes, Artaxerxes I and Darius II. But I personally doubt this because there are no inscriptions to actually prove this, so it's just speculation. Even at Persepolis there are two other royal tombs of similar form cut into the mountainside that overlook the palace and terrace, where these are thought to be the tombs of Artaxerxes II and Artaxerxes III, and yet there are no inscriptions, once again making it speculative. What is good is that Darius' tomb is the only one with inscriptions that actually states who it belongs to. Now that I can work with. But anyway, To bring this into perspective with regard to the Daniel 9 prophecy, it's these names: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, names we've all heard of. Books like Ezra, Nehemiah, they give tribute to these great Persian kings. And it is these key names that we need to be aware of when we're solving the riddle of the 70 weeks prophecy, because these kings were present during the last remaining years of this prophecy. If we look at verse 24 of Daniel 9, the passage says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now these are the words of Gabriel informing Daniel that this predetermined time of 70 weeks will end with a Leviticus practice of making everything right before God. If we look at this on the PowerPoint chart, we'll learn that each week of the 70 weeks represents 7-year periods, where what we'll see in this documentary is that the first 14 years of the Persian Empire, starting in 536 BC, directly corresponds to the last 14 years of the Daniel 9 prophecy. As we unpack this mystery, you'll see that every aspect of the 70 weeks prediction, every aspect aligns exactly to biblical and historical literature. It is unquestionable. So, let's continue and let's have a listen to what's said about the first Persian king and how he fits within Daniel's prophecy. The other tomb is here at Pasargadae. Some 80 kilometers from Persepolis lies the burial place of one of the most renowned Persian kings, Cyrus the Great. Now that is a name we should not forget, because it is Cyrus who established the Persian Empire. Looking at the tomb, we can see it's different to the ones we saw at Necropolis. It seems to resemble a small ziggurat with an edifice at its apex. There's a pyramidal peaked rooftop and a small opening to the side, and in there would house the body of Cyrus, no doubt adorned in Persian style. Now the amazing thing about Cyrus is that the very year he conquered the Babylonians in 536 BC, the ancient text says that Cyrus was moved in his heart to allow the Jews to return back to their homeland to rebuild the temple. Now this must have been an exciting time for the Jewish nation, as they had been in captivity by the Babylonians for some 70 years. And so, with Cyrus allowing them to return to the homeland, no wonder he was seen as a glorious and righteous king. In fact, according to the book of Isaiah, Cyrus was even called their Messiah. Hard to imagine, isn't it? A Persian king called the Messiah. And yet Isaiah calls King Cyrus the Anointed One and the Shepherd. Now that's a huge title. And so in the year 536 BC, which is the beginning of the 69th week, this was the very year that King Cyrus and his Persian Empire overthrew the Babylonians. And as they were beginning to restructure the world, Cyrus decides to issue a decree for the Jewish community to return to their homeland so as to rebuild their temple, as described in Ezra 1. Now we must not forget that as this Messiah figure, God's anointed one, was ruling the world, this was also the time when Daniel had been reading the book of Jeremiah, who states 3 times that when the Babylonians first attacked the house of Judah in 606 BC, it was Jeremiah who prophesied that in 70 years, God was going to deal with the Babylonians and that the Jewish captives would all return back to their homeland at the end of these 70 years. Fascinating. Thus, in 536 BC, as Daniel was reading Jeremiah's prophecies, and then seeing that King Cyrus issued the decree for the Jews to return to their homeland, Daniel had the epiphany, the revelation, realizing that Jeremiah's prophecies had come true. Daniel saw the fulfillment of those predictions. Yes, he understood its meaning. Now, this is where it gets interesting. It was at Daniel's revelation that the angel Gabriel visits Daniel and says to him, I'll read it straight from the text, Daniel 9 verse 20. While I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of the people Israel and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I'd seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me, and he talked with me, and he said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, the command went out, I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. Let me paraphrase that to you. Gabriel says to Daniel, you are well esteemed because you desire to know God's predetermined plan. Well done, Daniel, for seeking to understand Jeremiah's prophecy. And Daniel, I'm going to give you another prophecy that you will also be able to understand. And he gives him the 70 weeks prophecy. Now, the reason that Daniel would be able to understand is because, just like he did with Jeremiah's prophecy, he was actually going to see another prophecy come true. Daniel was going to see this 70 weeks prophecy come to fulfillment. In other words, he was going to see the next 14 years unfold exactly as Gabriel had said. So, in accordance to our timeline, 536 BC was not only the beginning of the Persian Empire, it was also the beginning of the 69th week. In essence, this 69th week was a time of rejoicing and prospering for the people of the land. But an undercurrent was stirring. Not everyone was happy. The surrounding nations that had captured that land weren't pleased that the Jews were returning, and so hostility started to brew, and they began to frustrate and trouble the temple restoration plans. Fortunately, under Cyrus, no one dared harm the Jews at this stage. But as life would have it, 7 years later, in the year 529 BC, Cyrus the Great dies. There's a few versions of how he died from all different sources, but it's definitive to say that it was in a war with one of the neighbouring nations. But with this great king's death, this first Persian king, the boom period had finished, and with it, peace and safety, which meant the Jews had no protection. Yes, although the Jewish community were resettling back in their land since 536 BC, the book of Ezra states that the enemies of Judah and Benjamin set out to frustrate the temple reconstruction process by hiring professionals in order to discourage the Jews. However, despite these neighbouring nations strategizing to cause harm and conflict, the Jews persevered under the political protection of King Cyrus. Ezra 4 verse 3. And so if we align this to the Daniel 9 prophecy, it's quite clear that the streets of Jerusalem were certainly being rebuilt within troublesome times. Additionally, the prophecy states that at the end of the 69th week, which is exactly 483 years from the completion of Solomon's temple, if you chronologically map it out in the Bible, it is determined that the Messiah was cut off, and, amazingly enough, the death of this anointed one, King Cyrus the Great, was in the year 529 BC, fulfilling the 69th week element of the 490-year prophecy. And with that, the end of the 69th week, this obviously rolls into the beginning of the 70th week, the last and final 7 years of the prophecy. So I guess we have to ask, after the death of Messiah Cyrus, what happened? Who was now going to rule the Persian Empire in this last and final week? Consequently, with the Messiah cut off at the end of the 69th week, the Persian Empire appointed two kings. One was King Artaxerxes, and the other was Cyrus's son, Prince Cambyses. Scholars are unsure of the dynamics of this dual relationship. Maybe one was government and the other was royalty. But however it worked, it was now a new system different to that what was under Cyrus. And with Cyrus dead, those surrounding nations saw an opportunity to antagonize the Jews. So, according to the book of Ezra, they lobbied King Artaxerxes, who believed their deception, and rode into Jerusalem and put a stop to the restoration work of the Jewish temple. And so there it is. After the death of Cyrus, those enemies of Judah and Benjamin, who had set out to frustrate the temple reconstruction, had devised a new plan to further disrupt the Jews by accusing them of corruption and conspiracy to rebel. Listen to the letter that was sent to King Artaxerxes, Ezra 4, 11, 16. To King Artaxerxes from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river and so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls and repairing its foundations. Let it be known to the king that if the city is built and the walls completed, they will pay no tax, tribute or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we receive support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonour. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that a search may be made in the book of records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. And so with that, King Artaxerxes made the decision to cease all temple construction work in response to these anti-Semitic tensions, where the rebuilding of the temple and the walls came to a complete standstill. Ezra 4, 7-23. Now, though Artaxerxes is mentioned ceasing the temple work, what's interesting is that there is absolutely no mention of the other reigning Messiah, King Cambyses, or King Campeggir, as the Persians call him. It is as if biblical literature does not wish to remember this other king's name, which is fascinating because this King Cambyses is mentioned in other historical literature, but for some reason is omitted from the book of Ezra. Nevertheless,
the Daniel 9 prophecy is still being fulfilled in that the first Messiah suffers death at the end of the 483rd year, the 69th week, followed by a subsequent ruler or rulers who govern the final 7 years of the 490-year prophecy.
So let's recap. The year is 536 BC, the beginning of the 69th week. The Persian Empire comes to the world stage, and it's a time of plenty. People are rejoicing. The Jews are rebuilding their temple despite the surrounding nations' attempts to disrupt them. But at the end of the 69th week, in 529 BC, King Cyrus dies. The Messiah is cut off. It's now the 70th week, and the Persian Empire appoints two kings, Prince Cambyses and King Artaxerxes, who puts a stop to the temple work. Now it's not until another 7 years that the Jews are allowed to continue building their temple. The interesting thing is that biblical literature is completely silent about that 7 years. Scholars in itself say that this speaks volumes, that perhaps the reason why nothing's recorded is because they do not want to remember what happened during that period. In other words, it was a time of darkness.
It's a period of darkness. Now, interestingly, verse 27 uses phrases like sacrifice and the oblation to cease, the overspreading of abominations, making it desolate. These are terms which describe the 7 final years and represents a time of basically destruction, war, and violence. These are terms used to describe how the subsequent kings after Cyrus allowed detestable practices to occur. Practices which are offensive not only to the people of the land, but of course to God. Consequently, the war and the violence came as a result from rebellion. Rebellion against a corrupt government, a rebellion that is unleashed throughout the entire Persian Empire. There is no longer order, but anarchy. It seems that this is the very reason why the Bible is silent. This violence was so satanic, too evil to mention. And with the Bible not going into detail, that doesn't help solve our riddle, which means we have to ask ourselves, is there any other historical evidence that shows either King Cambyses or King Artaxerxes acting irresponsibly by doing detestable practices? 2, is there any proof that because of their corrupt actions that this resulted in the vassal nations rebelling, causing war and destruction throughout all of the Persian Empire? And 3, more importantly, was this rebellious period limited to precisely 7 years, which of course exactly ends on the 490th year?
Yes, the answers to what happened during those 7 silent years are all recorded here on the Behistun Mountains in Kermanshah, Iran. Okay, we are 100 meters up from the road, the ancient road that led from old Babylonia into the Persian kingdom. And up on this limestone cliff is the Behistun Inscription. Now, as you can see, these cuneiforms, it is written in 3 universal languages, in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Now, the Old Persian, which is right here in front, is 5 columns and it's 593 lines. The Elamites to the side are 8 columns with 414 lines. And then there's the Babylonian, which is 1 column, 112 lines. And they're all describing a situation that happened here. If we look above and you see the relief, you can see King Darius there. Now, King Darius, he's holding a bow and an arrow, which signifies a time of war. And he has his left foot on a supine figure, which is reputed to be Golmata. To the left of Darius is 2 servants, possibly his friends, and to the right of Darius are 9 1 meter high figurines with nooses around their necks and their hands tied, signifying that they are conquered leaders. And floating above this relief is the winged representative of Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian Persian god. And there it is. What an amazing thing to feast your eyes upon. Fortunately, all this deciphering has been done by scholars George Grotefend in 802 and Henry Rawlinson in 843, which means all I have to do is summarise their findings. Now in column 1, King Darius introduces himself and he proclaims his heritage, acknowledging his father and his father's fathers and so on. And King Darius says he is the 9th king. And then he praises Ahura Mazda for being king of Persia. Next, he names the 23 nations that are subject to him. And again, he praises Ahura Mazda that he has brought order to the empire. What he says next is interesting. He introduces Cambyses, King Cambyses, and he mentions him 12 times. Listen up. He says Cambyses killed his own brother secretly. And then after doing that, he went to Egypt and caused rebellion there. And then the rebellion didn't stop there, but the rebellion spread through all of Persia and Media. Darius then gives the date when Cambyses dies. He says he dies of natural causes, but giving the date corresponds to the year March 522 BC. Now, isn't that just fascinating? King of Persia, King Cambyses, kills his own brother and then causes rebellion widespread. Now, apart from murdering his brother, what did Cambyses do that caused such a rebellion?
Fortunately, there is another source of evidence that not only substantiates the Behistun inscription, but also gives us great insight into what King Cambyses did that caused such widespread rebellion throughout the Persian Empire. The source comes from the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, who describes the life of Cambyses. He writes that Cambyses abuses his responsibility as the Persian king, a ruler who opposed his rightful duties. Herodotus records in detail how this ruler engaged in practices that were so unruly and offensive that rebellion became paramount throughout the kingdom. One account shockingly describes Cambyses disrespecting the empire's multicultural religions by having all the Egyptian priests executed, as well as having the dead Egyptian king's body exhumed just so he could publicly stab it. Cambyses' distaste for religions resulted in many sacred temples being burnt to the ground across the nations, irrespective of their faith. Another account records Cambyses blaming the counselors for the death of his father Cyrus, consequently had them slain. So disturbing are the accounts that as you start reading, you get a fairly accurate picture of what this king was like. Herodotus goes to great lengths to describe the evils, as he calls them, of Cambyses, and that he was diseased in the mind. Overall, it is easy to see why rebellions became exponential. King Cambyses was bad news. But what's even more fascinating is that the life of Cambyses aligns perfectly to the Daniel 9 prophecy. At the end of the 7 years, in 522 BC, Herodotus writes that King Cambyses commits suicide by falling upon his own sword. Yet despite the death of this anti-king, the Persian Empire still remained in rebellion, complete chaos with pirate rebels rising up to try and take the Persian throne. Look at this. In the year 522 BC, Darius names the first of the rebel leaders, Gaumata, who raised up an army and actually captured the Persian throne. Obviously very short-lived because he obviously ended up underneath Darius's foot. Darius continues and starts to name the other 9 leaders that start to rebel, the other 9 nations, Elam, Egypt, Media, Assyria, just to name a few. And he describes the great battles with those nations. Continues right through to the end of column 3. And then in column 4, Darius summarizes these conflicts, and he names the nations again, and he names each of those rebel leaders just so that there is no confusion who they are. The picture is quite clear. The period during this time under the leadership of King Cambyses was a period of violence and rebellion that on first impressions one would think it would be insurmountable. And that's the amazing thing about the Behistun Inscription. Within its hieroglyphics, King Darius records in 3 languages, acknowledging the many battles that he faced while bringing order back into the Persian Empire. He describes in detail the incredibly hostile and rebellious period throughout the 127 provinces during the reign of King Cambyses, and that at the determined time it was himself, King Darius, who reformed it completely, subjugating multiple revolts and ending the violence once and for all. Just think about how huge that is. After 7 years of global revolts, King Darius brings order back into the empire. No wonder he set up this memorial in Kermanshah, as it represents a very significant time in history. So in a nutshell, this was an Armageddon of the day. The entire Persian Empire was in complete disarray. Multiple nations were rising up, rebelling against the dictatorship of King Cambyses. And with a king committing murder, one can only speculate what effect this had on the empire. Pirate rebel leaders were rising up, trying to take the throne. Some were successful. It was a time of war and violence. It was rampant across the nation.
And with war comes significant loss of life. This was certainly a time of unrest, a hostile and desperate time for the people of the land. And so after enduring 7 years of unstable leadership of King Kermanshah, he dies of unnatural causes according to the Behistun Inscription. And thus King Darius was appointed to the throne, where he sorts the entire Persian Empire out within a matter of months.
Amazing, isn't it? That Darius achieves peace in such a short period. But what's more amazing is that all this information perfectly aligns with each element of the Daniel 9 prophecy. It's been right in our nose, our face, all along. There is, however, one last final aspect of the prophecy that needs to be solved. The scripture states that at the end of the 70th week, at the end of the 490th year, there must be an end of sins, reconciliation made for sin, which brings in righteousness, which according to Leviticus can only be one thing: atonement.
Let's build upon what we know. At the beginning of the 70th week, the Persian Empire appoints two kings, King Artaxerxes and King Cambyses, who causes rebellion and violence throughout the empire, spreading abominations everywhere. But as predetermined, at the end of the 70th week, Cambyses dies, which inaugurates King Darius, who then has to fight 19 battles and bring the entire Persian Empire back into order. Now, King Darius had a job on his hands. After the aftermath of war, he had to restore a broken kingdom. And being a religious man, he issues the decree for everybody to rebuild their lives, and especially one for the Jews to continue building their temple and be right with their God. And according to biblical literature, Ezra performed the atonement ritual of sacrificial animals in the year 522 BC. Not only was this funded by the Persian Empire, but it also fulfilled the final aspect of the 70 weeks prophecy.
Indeed, the Behistun Inscription concludes with King Darius affirming an assurance that under his authority there would be ongoing stability throughout the kingdom. As part of his stability, the Persian Empire writes a letter to the Jewish community stating that they'll continue to fund the temple restoration project in accordance with the decrees issued by King Cyrus, King Darius and King Artaxerxes, Ezra 6:14. And within this official mandate, King Artaxerxes asserts that part of the money must be used to purchase animals for the Jewish sacrifices within the altar of the temple, Ezra 7:17-26. Consequently, the Jewish priest Ezra arrives in Jerusalem in order to make preparation towards a day of atonement. And so in the year 522 BC, the first of the official blood sacrifices was performed on the completed foundations of the temple, Ezra 8:35. This was a necessary event to put an end to the rebellion of mankind, to provide forgiveness for all the people. It was a day that involved a public confession of sin which wiped away the nation's sins and allowed the people to reaffirm their allegiance to God ultimately sealing God's righteousness back into the land. Ezra 9 verse 6 to chapter 10 verse 8. And so in summary, 522 BC was the 490th year. Peace and stability had been restored back into the kingdom by Darius, and Ezra's atonement was needed to bring everyone back into the joyous presence and celebration of God. It was certainly a momentous celebration for the Jews, and was especially needed after having suffered those last 7 painful years. This was a piece of history that no one should forget.
I can see why King Darius chose this road. It is the main thoroughfare from Babylonia into the Persian Empire. I can see why Darius chose this mountainside to put the Behistun Inscription. This magnificent monument was carved here for all to see. King Darius did not want anybody to forget what happened here, the Armageddon that happened here. This is a big deal. Let me read what King Darius writes in the 4th column. He says, "Now let what has been done by me convince you. For the sake of the people, do not conceal it. If you do not conceal this edict, but if you publish it to the world, then may Ahura Mazda be your friend. May your family be numerous, and may you live long." The problem is that we've forgotten what's happened here some 2,500 years ago. We've forgotten about the revolts and the rebellions that happened here. We've forgotten that Darius was the victor. King Darius was a savior. He set the people free. He allowed them to restore their lives. He even allowed atonement for the people and to be right with God. Overall, this video has shown that the first 14 years of the Persian Empire directly correlates to the last 14 years of the famous Daniel 9 prophecy. Daniel's 70 weeks was written to remind us of God's predetermined plan and the importance of being a good Messiah.
And so there you have it. Every aspect of the prophecy has been answered. The mystery of Daniel 9 has finally been solved. In summary, this prophecy is a predetermined 490-year period that involves Cyrus the Great, the anointed one who was cut off at the end of the 69th week. It involves the 70th week being a time of global violence and rebellion. 7 years where a multitude of nations revolt against a corrupt world empire. And it concludes with a Day of Atonement celebration exactly on the 490th year, a Leviticus practice of public confession and making things right before God, ultimately sealing the prophetic timeline. Ironically, the last 14 years of the famous Daniel 9 prophecy directly correlates to the first 14 years of the Persian Empire. I'm Stephen Shephard, and it has been my extreme privilege to share this truth about this debated prophecy, as well as being able to journey with you through Persepolis, Necropolis, and Kermanshah Mountains. Thank you for listening.